Alrighty. Let's see what we got here. Hi. If you can see this, I'm successfully streaming already. And I'm getting stuff together. I gotta say today I'm not feeling super well. I might be coughing up pieces of lung. I gotta wonder whether maybe back in March I did in fact survive coronavirus and I'm doing sort of long-term stuff. Maybe I'll know about that someday. Anyways, word of warning, I could have fits of horrible coughing. I'm not sure to what extent I'll get that. I took some stuff called Mucinex and that might help me out going forward. Hey Andy. And like I said on the plugin video, everything in my system broke and I had to build it all up again. So what I'm going to be doing is building the chat window again. Let's start by popping that out and dragging it. We'll set it to live chat. At this moment, if I get like trolls into YouTube, I just gotta laugh. I can't even worry about that. That's funny to me right now. So let's see. I'm going to want to throw on window capture. We'll call that. I'll call it chat window capture, and I will assign it to the one we want. And it's huge. Okay, so if we have to resize this, I'm not really quite sure how I'm going to do that, but maybe I can. This is very awkward work because I can't fit this on the screen properly. Meh. No worries. Hey, it does actually fit. Alrighty. So I got a neat little chat window, and we'll go from there. And I did not update my time thingy, which it in theory needs to be updated because I definitely lost Patreon commitment going into the new month, but that always happens. So let's deal with some of these things like getting the window off of my screen so that I'm not staring at it, and shutting off the there we go, good enough. I'm trying to shut off the moving camera thingy so that I'm not constantly staring at my own image on the screen. All of these things are pains in the butt, but whatever, this is what we do. So I've named this live Q&A Channel 8. So logically, this is what you can do. If you want to ask about Channel 8, and I do also have my sheaf of notes of future things that I can do going forwards. Damn, this is a large sheaf of notes. And I have some blank paper to make more notes on, and the pen that I can draw on and then hold it up to the camera so you can see it. All in all, we are rolling. Also, there was something I wanted to fool with a little bit, namely, if I go to filters, here's what I was talking about when I said that I was using the filter thingy, which I think is no longer, yeah, that's no longer loaded into the Atom. But the little image of painterly stuff is what I used to make this. And I've got it set up so that it's going from an amount of 0 here to an amount of 1 here, and I had it set up to be a little bit more warm and saturated than I really needed. So what I'm going to do is dial it back just a hair and go with that. It starts to get almost like the Airwindows audio plugins, because fooling around with this video stuff, one of the things I was able to do which led to all these problems, was go to a Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera from the Panasonic DSLR that I was using. And the thing about that is their sensors are very different. And by that, what I mean is the Panasonic had colors that just kind of popped, but they got kind of exaggerated in certain places. Like reds and things went crazy and were excessive. And the Blackmagic, much more well controlled, and it was putting out a much more stable color gamut. There were still some funny little irregularities. And the reason that happens is because I'm using a camera to record images that are watercolor paints. Those are distinct pigments of very high saturation. I've been continually getting more and more high quality pigments. I ended up going with what it says on that little card, Stuart Semple watercolors. And they're not cheap, but they were very high quality pigments indeed. And for that reason, when you use the camera to take a picture of it and then you hold up the actual card next to the screen and go, what do I need to correct in order to make this look like the real image? Well, your real image, and this is also during daylight, is literal pigments of very high color intensity. And then you're converting it to basically RGB with the camera and the camera sensor, and then turning it back. So every single camera, much like digital to, analog to digital converters, has its limitations. And you can't go by what the camera people say, because it's like, oh yeah, we have perfect images. Our gamut is perfect. Well, it might be perfect, but there's funny little irregularities in there. And that's what I've been working on. So, I'll go back to, and I'll get to what you're asking for, Andy, although you're somewhat on a wrong track, so don't get a sense that I'm going to tell you the answer to that, because unfortunately you're asking one of those questions that you can't really answer. Like what I'm talking about is I can go from this, which is the raw Blackmagic camera, to this, which is obviously a little pumped up, and I'm going to leave it that way. It's not quite the film look thing that I was doing earlier, but this is kind of what I can do, like as Airwindows, trying to dive into this other area and apply the same principles. Because, Airwindows is named for the concept of if things are windows on the sound, or if a camera is a window on site or whatever, and the windows can be dirty or colored or have glare or whatever, you wipe all of that stuff out and then the reality of it comes through. And that's what I'm working on. And it gets fussy. Like I'll go right back to OBS again, because I seem to be tireless as far as wanting to fiddle with these things. Because I know I had a feeling of, like, at full crank, this is still a little too vivid. Like, the color of the blonde wreck is a little too orange, and the blue and purple guitar strap, it pops a little too much, although it's pleasing. And then if I pull it back even to 2/3, all of a sudden it's like, yeah, this is getting kind of dead. So I'll call it like 80. Let's go to 75. I know I'm going to start answering questions in a moment, but you know me. I'm doing this thing, and I'm getting caught up in it, and that's just how that rolls. 75, and so I have made some adjustments where this starts to feel like literally an air window. Like there's nothing between the you and me sitting there, and that's useful in many ways. So yeah, let's look at this chat. Right off the top of the chat here, can you make the tempo flavor reference more detailed and add more flavors? It doesn't really work that way. It's like only a faint overtone that might combine with whatever the thing is. And as far as the tempo references that I made and I think about, the deal there is it's mostly about like tension and release. It's mostly about a feeling of smoothness versus a feeling of intenseness, sort of unstable versus stable. So the talking about things like, well, if you need to do melancholy, it needs to sit at exactly this tempo, doesn't actually work. And the card that I've stuck as the cover card for this Q&A, because I don't have other, when I do a stream, I've discovered that if I tack a poster frame onto it, it's just, that's what it is going forwards. And my choices for that, like with many things, I don't have time to do all of this stuff, so I wind up like with nothing to go by. And the last one was a image out of one of the music jams, and looks really weird and abstract. So this one is a random picture that happened to be sitting on my desktop, and it happens to be the list you're talking about of, you know, so arrogant or swaggering or whatever. And that was just me kind of extending outwards in that direction, but it doesn't really work both ways. It's like, if you're already there, maybe that describes how those things feel, but you can't really go, I want to make something that seems arrogant, therefore, as long as I pick this tempo, that's what it's going to be. There is an ambiguity about it. So yeah, the and dialing right down a little bit, double entendre has something. So how does a spiral saturation exactly work? I can show you that, and I can show you that by drawing it. So first of all, there's a simple mathematical function, and you can use a sine function. If your signal gets louder and louder, and you apply a sine function to it, mind you, it connects here, then it'll start rolling off more and more, distorting more and more, to the point where if you're running through a sine function and your signal is getting louder and louder, it's like on this angle, there will come a point where you're doing sine of this number and it'll stop getting louder anymore, which is about, I think, a quarter of the way around the circle. And that is distortion. That is the thing where if it just continued to go flat, you'd have a complete distortion at that point. No matter how much louder the input signal got, it would never get louder on the output. You would have full distortion simply from using a sine function. But if you don't actually put in that clamp on it at exactly the right point, the sine function wraps around. It starts getting quieter again, and then it will go negative, and then it will start going positive again. And that makes a wave shaper, like you might get in a Eurorack synthesizer. And that is not spiral, that is density. Density is the plugin that I made way back in the day, like 2007, that was about using that functionality of going, this is a sine function. That means that 0 equals 0. Sine of 0 is going to also be 0. But as you keep getting louder, it starts to distort up to a certain point where it's at full distortion. And one of the things about that is that if you use a sine function to do your distorting with, that is the softest transfer function you can ever possibly have. You can't get smoother than a sine shape, like a circular function. It's going from literally, I will smooth this through. It's going from literally 0 to full clip with the slightest change between any 2 points on the getting louder side. And if you clip it off at this point, That's the softest transfer function you can have, the softest distortion function you can have. And that's what you hear out of density, is this sine distortion function. Now, what's slider? What's slider? My plugins have sliders. What's spiral? It starts with an S. Spiral is a thing where I decided this was very colored. Like you do this and it feels excessively saturated, like it's a fat, overloaded sound. Let's draw another picture. And it makes it start to feel like stuff early on, like the quieter sounds, get pushed forwards. So I'll draw another picture. Don't consider this accurate. This is just a way of thinking about it. So it feels like when you saturate with the sine curve, you get the full distortion, but then it feels like the quieter stuff is being made louder. You sort of boost into it, and that makes this stuff at the beginning, the quiet stuff, feel like it's boosted, feel like it's louder, because that's the way that it does. Granted, all of it is literally being turned down, because that's how the sine of something works, is it will cut it back. But yeah, and that's why sine folds like that become wave shapers. Spiral acts like this. It does an interpolation where if you're down here at the beginning, you're going to choose this line. And if you're up here at the top, you're going to choose this line. It steps between those two things. Like down here, 100% this. Up here, 100% this. Here, 50-50. Guess what? We're here. Because we're blending between the full loudness, and we're using the input level to determine this, and the zero loudness, which is entirely input signal. So it's like we have a dry-wet control, and the dry-wet control is being modified at audio rates. It's being modified literally by the input signal. So all the input stuff, all the input stuff that is quiet is almost entirely dry. All the stuff that is super loud is entirely wet, and it's all working off the density function, the sine function that feels like it makes stuff louder and fatter. So what spiral is doing is it is making an alternate shape that's kind of like the sine function, but for the quieter stuff it's not. It's cleaning it up because it's literally going more towards dry. And that makes a sort of composite wave shape that is still being changed as slowly as possible between the quietest stuff and the loudest stuff. It's still the softest transfer function you can get, but all the quieter noises are becoming literally dry. So it's cleaning it up. It's removing distortion where there was distortion before. And that is how spiral saturation exactly works. The reason that it only adds like 5 or 6 harmonics and that's it is because this is how you make harmonics. With the super smooth kind of stuff, you start adding harmonics one at a time. The gentler the transfer function curve, transfer function being the difference between the input and the output, the gentler the curve, the more it's going to add harmonics one at a time. If you have a different curve, like this one that I've drawn, which is a little point, then there's no harmonics that are added, and as soon as you hit that point, all of the harmonics in the world after that point go. Like the the degree of harmonics is determined by the sharpness of this curve. So for that, let's say this is infinite sharpness, right? So there is a absolute corner there. It is a rigidly defined corner, whereas this is the smooth curve. With this, you get one harmonic and then barely anything after that, which also helps with aliasing because you can't alias a harmonic you're not generating. This super sharp point, if it's literally infinite sharpness, it's going to make literally infinite harmonics. They will go forever. And then they will alias back into the audio band forever. So it's all about, in digital signal processing, how suddenly are you making a change in what you're doing? And that is why the channel series and density and so on tend to produce only one harmonic at a time. And in Plug-in Doctor, you'll find other stuff that generates lots of harmonics going forwards. And this has its own advantages and disadvantages. It's a different sound. It's like if you were doing a distortion guitar and like, do you want to use only a single triode, really spongy amp with a valve rectifier and stuff, and then run it through a variac so that it's really soft and is running on like only like 105 volts instead of 120 and make everything really squishy? Or do you want to, like Steve Howe on the Yes album Relayer, run a Telecaster into some crappy little PV transistor guitar amp for this really grating sound? The difference there is the really soft, spongy tube amplifier is going to do the same thing. Tubes have a slower distortion function. Same with field effect transistors can have the same kind of shape. Whereas regular silicon transistors will have a much sharper angle. So the soft, squishy stuff, and it's the same deal with triodes versus pentodes. Pentodes can be more linear and then distort more sharply. In fact, they're designed to be more linear because for high quality audio reproduction, you don't necessarily want this super soft, spongy transfer curve where you're very slowly getting into distortion. Like for audiophile purposes, half the time you don't want any distortion. So it's like you're going to want pentode over triode because it's not really about what harmonics you get. You don't want any harmonics at all. You're going to stay entirely within the distortion zone without distorting anything. And like I said, Steve Howe's tone on a relayer was a Telecaster into a PV. That's grating. I mean, that's nasty. But it's not a digital amp. That's a entirely analog guitar setup that's producing the most piercing harmonics you could possibly imagine. And he chose it for that reason. He was like, well, this is a really fierce Yes album, so I want the most aggressive guitar sound that I possibly could have. And everything about that tone is just, the harmonics just take your head off. It's so bright. It's so painful. But it's not digital. It's not aliasing. It's just throwing a chain of harmonics similarly to Robert Fripp's work in King Crimson. Fairly often he's doing things like, he's done a lot of Roland jazz chorus distortions, and you can do those. It has a very distinct sound, but that's a sound with a lot of overtones on it, and that's a lot of transistor clipping. Roland JC120s are not tube amplifiers. So the whole deal with some of these tones, or choices of guitar tones, is in the analog domain, you can pick whether you want a really soft clip or a really hard clip that generates lots of harmonics, because those harmonics, they'll be bright and nasty, but they won't be aliasing. And in the digital domain, if you do more harmonics, they're always aliasing. So let's see now. I'll scan her out a bit. Best of luck with my video issues. Hey, well, I'm running an extra piece. I'm running a Blackmagic. Put it this way: it takes in an HDMI input, so I'm taking that, and it outputs to Thunderbolt. My computer no longer uses Thunderbolt, so it's like 1, 2, 3, 4 separate pieces of gear getting me from this ATEM to the computer, where there should be one, and that's a cable. So it's dumb, but it's like, well, I got it working, and so we'll run with this for the time being. Thank you for the good thoughts, though, as I do care about this stuff. Like everything that I touch, I'm always trying to see whether I can take it up a level. I think that's probably why people pay attention, those that do pay attention. Oh, goodness. So, have I felt comfortable with Reaper? I was advising somebody to use Reaper the other day. I'm not really using it myself, but there will probably come a time. And I know that when I saw the plugins and things that you did, that was kind of eye-opening, because I was like, oh my god, here is a working example of something that you did in Reaper that acts like a plugin, and this is all you need to make it happen. So honestly, people who are starting to get into plugins, you should be talking to Bo about maybe putting together some of this stuff in Reaper and use that, because it becomes like being able to script Reaper, and it becomes like being able to get this tone shaping stuff going with a lot less overhead than I ever had to deal with. Like if I was able to start that way, I might be just Reaper only to this day. I didn't. I started doing stuff with audio units, and I started doing stuff in Real Basic. And for that reason, my habit is to do that stuff. But clearly doing coding, plugin coding exclusively in Reaper using this method that Bo has is a pretty good idea. Seems to be good. Yeah. Andy, still about the tempo stuff. Yeah, it's basically like I can delineate and describe things that are on a level of subtlety that might be interesting. And I had some fun writing out that little card of what did what. In fact, that's why I saved it to my desktop, is I'm going to put that out somewhere. I'm going to find a way to connect it somewhere and adapt those takes on sort of moods and things. But I'll also have to put a disclaimer that this is like a poetic interpretation of it. So it doesn't work both ways. It's more like it kind of steers you a little bit. It's maybe, let me see if I can scooch this out of the way. Double click that. And there we go. So yeah, I am now looking at the thing that you were telling me about. And that image, the top thing, which goes stable, striving, unstable, and attaining, is really the heart of it. And then it just kind of continues, like the chill, stable column goes stable, serenity, relaxed, statement, confident, weightless, and dizzying. And then transcendent stillness of top speed when you get to 194 BPM. And that's all fine. But in basic concepts of tempo, like if you're doing 100 BPM, that does in fact feel relaxed. So it's not unreasonable to say that. And if you needed to do something where I need to do a tempo that feels like relaxed, it's not wildly out of place to go, all right, about 100 BPM, a little slower than 100 BPM, and we're good. That doesn't mean you can't also be like, I want up-tempo relaxed. Okay, try 131 BPM, or what did I have it as? 130 or so. And that will, I've described it as confident, but it will also feel more relaxed than some of the other ones, like 140. Many of these can be reinterpreted. Like I've got groove down there, and I chose 118. That's not unreasonable. But if you were doing a more low tempo thing and you wanted the same sort of intensity of focus, drop it back to what I called 102, which is testify. And that is what groove feels like when you take it down a notch and you're in this low speed, more relaxed form. Or like similarly with what I've got here is 106, 122, or 140. On the other card, it says 105, 122, 140. And I've described those as trample, forceful, and cranked. And forceful is like, it's actually fairly close to 120 BPM. You only have to push it a tiny bit to have it be like, oh my God, well, he's pounding away. Slowing it down, I described it as trample. Slowing it down even more to 90 BPM, I described it as huge. Speeding it up to 140, I described it as cranked. This is all basically the same mood. These are like synonyms in some ways. Speed it up to 160. I don't have it on that one. 161 or so. I describe it as haste, and crank it up to 183, and I described it as flailing. But it's all the same kind of like unstable and aggressive approach. So yeah, the descriptions, it's all very well and good, but you can't really dial back to only certain descriptions of things. So we've been talking about harmonics and things. Bo's got a quick question about hardware, and I do understand about some of those things. So how fast do tubes, FETs, silicons, and transistors distort? Are they as fast as digital audio, or is there a slew? That's an interesting question. That's a question that I can draw stuff about. Because the thing is, you're asking two separate questions, but it's still interesting. So, tubes, FETs, silicon transistors, digital audio. Here is how a transistor works. You got a junction, and the junction can pass electricity or not. And you've got a voltage coming in from the side that can change the junction from it conducts electricity to it doesn't conduct electricity. This is a diode basically just takes the energy and it's like, okay, if energy is, it can pass through, but if energy is coming from the other direction, it cannot. A silicon transistor or germanium transistor, or in a different sense, a field effect transistor is like it does not contact this path that passes the electricity, whereas the germanium and silicon ones, the incoming voltage does actually contact that and helps pass it. The details I can't tell you. I've only got a very vague sense of that. But bottom line is this is a tiny object and it passes electricity through this way. Here is a tube. A tube will have a huge voltage on this thing that's spitting out enormous amounts of energy, and a screen in a vacuum, which is why they call it a vacuum tube, that has a smaller voltage, and that smaller voltage will turn on or off the entire huge amount of energy being spat out by this plate. I'm trying to think of whether it's a cathode. Let's call it the cathode. Because I'm trying to think of whether the output is picked up by the plate or whether it's been put forth by the plate. Point being, this is like a pump from this side of the transistor through to this side of the transistor, and it's a tiny thing. These are large objects glowing red hot in a vacuum, spitting out enormous quantities of energy, and you're modulating them with this fine screen sitting in a vacuum. And the electrical voltage on the screen is going to tell you whether suddenly this output tube, which is another large metal object, has the full voltage. And these can go up to radio frequencies or not. So one significant thing about the difference between tubes and transistors is that tubes are kind of like your old-fashioned science fiction spaceships. Like, oh, the heavy copper bus bars carrying millions of amps. Back in the day, that's all they knew. They weren't down for the miniaturization stuff. So it's like the bus bars carrying billions of gigaamps of voltage, and their mighty vacuum tube, this and that. And this is about throwing really high voltages on these pieces of metal floating around in vacuum, spitting out forces of energy and plasma and modulating them with this grid. And one of the things that happens there is that as you are modulating the greatly enhanced voltages of amplifying things, this energy is being turned on and off by practically magic. It's the voltages on these grids, and they're like letting the electrons pass or not, and it's a lot of waste energy. But when you get down to the transistors, and this also might have to do with why some of the vintage stuff gets to have special tone qualities, because they got better at miniaturizing transistors as they went, you know. Really old transistors are relatively large chunks of silicon or germanium. And with the transistor, you're modulating the same amount of voltage, but it's all got to be pumped through this one little junction, and it gets smaller and smaller as it goes, and then you take the output. Rather than these are big chunks of metal being modulated by electrical fields. So, but there's a catch. Transistors can often be handled with just capacitors and resistors and stuff. You can bolt them directly to each other. Whereas with high-powered tube electronics, often you need to take the output of a transformer, because the way you're powering it is you get your super high voltage, you're like 400 volts or whatever, it'll kill you, don't play with these things, and you're running it through a transformer to the plate, and then the modulations will be sent through this coil of wire and grounded out at the power source supply, and then you're taking the output off of another coil of the transformer. Well, transformers have more of a slew. Transformers have limitations as to how fast they can change, but we're still talking about the incredibly sudden changes of huge amounts of power. Like, they're putting more power through the wires in the sense of how rapidly you can change from one state to another. With transistors, since you're having to pump energy through these things, that becomes a slew factor. So what you can get is, with the transformer, it goes, okay, I need to suddenly go to a very high power. So it's starting to pump the energy through, and the restrictions of how the transformer or op amp or whatever are doing are limiting the slew factor. And remember, I use slew as a tone shaper, so you don't necessarily always want to go for just ultimate slew speed. With the tube, going from the nothing to full power is just like hitting a brick wall. Like bam, suddenly it's there because you just changed the voltage potential of the grid, and all of a sudden all of the energy that's already being spit out at every given instant is transferred to the plate. Wham, like a brick wall. But then the transformer can only react so fast, and that's where your slew comes in. So it's almost like there's a smoothness to that curve also. It's going to slowly kick up to speed and then deliver all of its energy. Whereas the transistor, there is a discontinuity. All of a sudden it's starting to do its thing and then it stops. So, and this is all kind of highfalutin stuff. I'm trying to describe it in layman's terms and trying to avoid stepping out of my depth. There's a degree of out of my depth to this, although I do have some pretty good documentation for it. I have books on, old books on like the RCA book of vacuum tubes and transistors and stuff. So transformers function with a kind of slew because they can't react instantly. You've got to put energy into the iron core to get it out of the other coil. And digital audio is only as fast as one sample followed by the next sample. That is assuming you're talking about PCM samples like we normally use in DAWs and computers and stuff. Digital audio in like Class D amplifiers and SACD is direct stream digital. And what that means is the energy directing the output can change as fast as a vacuum tube. All of a sudden it's like, yep, this is just full output, and it'll go there as long as it takes for the output to get to its final destination. So digital is not necessarily faster than transistors. If it was, then we wouldn't worry about aliasing. Digital is slower than raw transistors, faster than some op amps, like stuff with slew limitations in the analog domain can be slower than digital as we understand it. Stuff that's well designed or doesn't have as many slew restrictions can easily be faster than digital is. Like digital is pretty much just like this, in that there is always a speed limit between the one state and the next state. Like if you've got your samples and you're doing a perfect job of capturing the samples, going from this position to this position is always going to be a limitation in slew rate. It's just that it's fast enough that it starts to have some of the problems of analog gear that has very fast slew rates. It's not always desirable because what you're doing is having a lot of energy in there at really high frequencies that aren't necessarily going to help you musically. So let's see. So there's the thing is tubes will react like this. FETs, field effect transistors, can have a curve as far as how they work, but they can also react very quickly, but they're limited by the size, much like transistors, where what it is a very tiny, delicate device. So it's going to be limited as far as how much energy it can instantly make available. And the speed at which they act is not the same as how they distort. Like, distort means how smoothly does it go from gets louder to it's distorted, it no longer can get any louder. Single-ended triodes, some kinds of FETs, will have these transfer curves where they slowly start rounding off. Other things, like some transistors and some digital processes, will have a sharp continuity where, like, put it this way. If you're doing a compressor, right, and you go like, okay, up to this point, we don't have to turn things down. And then when the signal gets louder than like -6 dB, that's our threshold. So if we get a sample, because we're going to not worry about reconstructing it, but we're going to be like, the samples are the sound. It's not true, but we're going to go like, okay, if we get a sample that is louder than -6, what are we going to do? We're a compressor. So let's figure out what we have to multiply the entire audio by to make everything sit underneath that point. And then we'll gradually make it come back. So what we do is we go, if we're over -6, at that point, everything has to be multiplied by whatever it will take in order to make the output not be louder than that. We're gonna do a no overshoot kind of thing. We're a compressor. We're acting like a limiter. There is no sample that can come out of this that's louder than -6. So anything that happens that's louder than -6, we're going to just be like, okay, now we divide by that much and go forwards. And then if it gets quieter again, we'll worry about turning it back up. That's the release time. That is this. That is a sharp discontinuity that will create lots of harmonics because we're taking this output that's getting louder, and all of a sudden it has to go straight. It has to go flat. It's fully distorted. No matter what it was, it's now -6. And that means that our signal went up like this, and then there's a sharp corner, and suddenly it's going straight until it goes back down again. And again, that is, I'm going to scroll up so that I can see how this related to what we were talking about. How fast do things distort? Are they as fast as digital audio? Is there a slew? This is how stuff generates aliasing, because sometimes things distorting or changing and doing them on purpose like they were fast is a problem. Sometimes that's just going to generate issues, and slew isn't necessarily your enemy. Like if you did this and you went, okay, we need to be lower than 6 dB down, and all of a sudden the compressor is going and it's way higher than we need. What do? Do we just suddenly make it whatever we need in order to not distort? Or do we go, hey, that's too loud. Let's start slowly increasing the amount by which we attenuate. And eventually we'll get to where it is -6 dB again, depending upon how much is over that point. And if we slowly apply that, and that's what's happening in the old plug-in pressure, which has always worked out pretty well for people. One of the things about that is that that's sort of a continuous algorithm that is chasing the desired output level. But if you hit it with super loud stuff, it's not a limiter. Pressure is a kind of compressor that is reacting in certain ways to how much beyond the thing is. So it's acting like it is a soft clip for how hard the compression comes on. You can do all kinds of stuff like that. And it's always about how crudely and immediately do you put in the thing that you're doing versus are you going to sort of let the input stuff steer what you're doing. I fool with my microphone a little bit. I feel like I'm not coming out loud enough. Am I too quiet, guys? I think I'm probably okay. I think if I get emphatic, then that will be correct volume level. So yeah, it will become an enthusiastic stream because clearly I can speak up and get excited about stuff. So fair enough. I will try to remember to set it that way. That's how things like slew and distortion and so on apply, is that specifically in the digital domain, smoothing things out and not reacting to them instantly helps you. This is how my stuff tends to avoid having major aliasing problems is because most of the things that I've done over the years, going way back, have always had this tendency to adapt to stuff rather than being like, this is the correct answer, therefore we make it type this answer in directly, and then it goes instantly to this thing. I've always been like, how does stuff sort of merge into or meld into whatever it is that we need? So distortions, compressors, things like that are rarely about just getting the correct result. And this is why I haven't had many limiters, because limiters kind of require you to be fiercely within this one zone. But I've also always had really good compressors, and that's why, is because if you do a compressor and then rather than be like, if you're above this amount, we immediately turn it down, infinite attack, and so on. If your stuff is sort of more squishy and mergy and doesn't take effect immediately, you can almost arbitrarily get away from aliasing. Like this is Surge and Surge Tide plugins that I've done. Beautiful example of that. Surge and Surge Tide have the input controlling the degree to which the amplitude point starts to curve. So it's like second or third order there. And as a result, it's like if we are too loud, then we end up making the amplifier turn itself down faster and faster. And then if we're not loud enough, it starts turning itself up. Well, it starts turning up the speed at which it's turning itself up. It's that many stages of removing it from things means that stuff is like utterly aliasing free. Like you can't make it alias in any kind of reasonable way. And it's still a compressor, but it's a very slow reacting compressor. That's one of the ways of doing it. But because of how that works, it has even less aliasing than something that was doing it in a more primitive sense, but was reacting instantly to stuff. It's like it's stages away from what causes aliasing to happen. Before you scroll off the screen, Shonak Shurgamkar, I just found about you and I want to start it with your plugins. You know, if you need to do a start out, I would honestly recommend go on my website and find Airwindows Starter Kit. There's a little text file that describes what the things are. And it might be a little primitive for you if you're talking about good limiters and compressors, and if you know the difference between those, you kind of know what you're doing. But still, that is a good starting point. It includes the one that I did the other day, which is Channel 8. And it's that gets very much into the which plugins do I recommend, rather than these are the things that I'm telling you that I need, therefore which ones of yours should I use. That's not always the way that works with me. More like, if you're doing stuff along the lines that I do, then grab Airwindows Starter Kit and see what you start getting out of adding these things. Like you could be all about like, well, what are the analog emulations that I need for the limiters and compressors and things, and I have no idea what console is. And I might be able to get you farther through like replacing the digital mix bus with console, even though that's a little bit difficult, or at least tricky. And some more limited stuff and more in the way of minimal processing, rather than treating it like, you know, how many things can I put on the guitar in order to make it sound like an analog guitar? How many things can I put on the mix bus in order to make it sound like an analog mix bus? But you're still dealing with many of the things that the DAW has that don't work to our favor. And there can be a different approach in mind. So yeah, I would recommend you start out with Airwindows Starter Kit. And beyond that, it becomes a matter of like experimenting and looking around for stuff. New updates.zip has a long list of what everything is in chronological order. And there are often multiple choices. Like if you're talking about compressors, well, you've got things like pressure. Pressure acts kind of like a varimu. It has a control that lets you govern that. There's a plugin actually called varimu, which tries to focus down that a little bit further. There's a plugin called PyWacket, which is like a compressor that modulates a density function, the negative density function, which means that PyWacket lets through attack transients, and the loud transient energy stuff is more accurate than it would otherwise be. So PyWacket is unusual in that it's like the anti-limiter. You can soften, or you can clamp stuff down a little bit, but sort of the overtones and edge and vibe of things, it's going to be retained a lot more accurately than with any other compressor, because the way it's quieting things down is leaving some of that hot energy in there, making it a very bad compressor, but sometimes a very good tone governor. And that also means that the loud transients, which can be the points that alias the most, if you leave those alone, you're not compressing as well as you did previously with a normal compressor, but you're also not aliasing those loud bursts of energy at all because they're not subject to the compression. It's weird, but it works, and you have to sort of try it to understand it. You might not actually like it. You might be after the opposite, but it's a thing. So there's certainly many compressors that I do. Yeah, Double Entendre mentions digital has to still evolve in terms of processing speed and range. That's the interesting thing, is because, like, my work with the analog digital modules, my work with the music thing modular stuff, chord organ, also radio music, but chord organ, those are signal generators, they're oscillators, and the idea is that it will play these little chords using whatever primitive waveforms you want. I mean, one of your options is a square wave. And you get them, and out of the box, they sound pretty cheap because they are a naive 44.1K digital generator. So they can do like a primitive, like 10-bit or something sine wave, or sawtooth wave, or square wave. There's no such thing as a multiple bit square wave. It's always literally 1 bit. And it can do those, but then it's a naive method of generating that stuff to a 44.1K sample rate. And that means that all of your square wave stuff aliases horribly, because it's naive, it's very primitive. And it has that sound. It has that sound of like, oh man, really old, cheesy, bad digital. But it runs off of this teensy. So you can tell the firmware, oh hey, this is just a very simple analog output. I'm only getting 10 bits out of that, but that's basically fine. I'm not really worried about that part. But can we go into supersonic frequencies? And the teensy, being just a little processor, is like, sure, what do you want? Oh, how about 300 kilohertz? Okay. And then as long as you're not doing hard things with the processing, it's like, cool, okay, let's go. If you do hard things with the process, it starts to glitch out, meaning that it switches around or it stops working entirely. But if you haven't outperformed the CPU, this digital output, rather analog output, is part of the CPU, it's part of the chip. And you can tell at what sample rate you want. So if you were just like, okay, this is a 1-bit, it's either on or off, but I want it to be 500 kilohertz. As long as the teensy is able to do it, it's like, sure, no problem. And that fixes aliasing. So when we talk about pushing whatever the heck happens in digital evolving in terms of processing speed and range, there are ways of getting around some of that stuff. Like you can have the simple teensy and you can have the chord organ. and telling it to process at 340K, and then telling it like, yeah, just do a square wave, that's fine. Or you can tell it to do sines and things like that, and that also works very nicely. But telling it to do a square wave, like your 12-bit or whatever, literally doesn't matter. A square wave is a 1-bit signal. And if you're doing it at 340K, you're very immune from a lot of aliasing. Like, technically, it's still going to produce it because there's no limit to how fast a naive square... You generate a naive square wave using a digital thing. And no matter what sample rate it is, there's going to be some aliasing just because it's like within the mathematical possibilities of it. If you're doing literally the same frequency as an even subdividing of the sample rate, then that's no aliasing. But anything else, it's going to wiggle and scooch around a little bit. And then if you're picking a really high sample rate like that off of even a very primitive chip, or as these primitive things get fancier, like the Teensy is running at like 96 megahertz or something. It's a tiny little embedded processor, but it turns out you can make that little engine spin really fast. And when you do that, you start being able to do sample rates that are really fast. And you can use a digital output as an analog output if all you're doing is a square wave. You can do multiple digital outputs and reconstruct a crude and simple multi-bit wave just by controlling them and having them be the relevant bits and adding them together with resistors. You're making a digital to analog converter that way. So there are many possibilities as far as working with evolving digital around not having to do everything in PCM digital. And like, this is as many bits as we have, and we only use this highest sample rate as we absolutely need, and therefore we're fine. Well, aliasing means you might want to run a much higher sample rate than that, and I'm not sure that there are many significant limits to how nice it can get if you just start cranking it. Like, I'm already doing 340K sample rate on the Teensies. I'm quite happy with how they sound. On the other hand, if I could do 3000K, say gigahertz sample rate from some little tiny chip, and it's like, this is the new embedded processor, and it runs at this many gigahertz, and so therefore I'm like, okay, can I have a square wave output that I will amplify in the analog domain that is running at a gigahertz sample rate? And if the embedded processor is like, sure, cool, no problem, then I now have a super high quality square wave generator. I have one that I could pick incredibly high pitched square waves and it'll be clean as a whistle, super free of aliasing. And you just keep reducing the aliasing. You just keep reducing those problems, much like I keep reducing quantization problems using the dithering to floating point that I do. Like, it very quickly gets to where you're not in a problem, is what I find. Like, with the dithering stuff, that very quickly gets to where that's not really a problem anymore. And then you can go beyond, and I like to, but honestly, it doesn't have to be a problem. And by the same token, using a really primitive digital waveform generator that sounds terrible at 44.1K, you crank it up to like 340 or 300K, and it's immediately quite a bit better, to the point where it's like, hey, I can run with this. This is giving me some really nice square wave generators. This might be one of my preferred square wave generator. I mean, it's able to generate this square wave, but I get to control the pitch really well. I don't have to worry about oscillator drifting or whatever. It's gonna be really accurate as far as the pitch generation. Granted, with the caveat of timing jitter on the clock frequency. Like, if I can do a more stable clock, that will help it sound better too. But again, we just keep getting better and better as far as refining this stuff. And considering that people so often jump to the conclusion of you can't hear sounds above 20 kilohertz, so therefore everything has to be made at a sampling rate of 44.1K, that's always been asinine. I think that is ridiculous. And aliasing turns out to be the reason why that's ridiculous. Like, you can go way beyond that. And yes, in the theoretical ideal of the Shannon information theorem and being able to capture stuff in digital audio, if you captured it at that frequency with perfect bit depth, then yeah, fine. But if you have to do anything, or if anything goes wrong, or if there are other limitations, you can start adding quality out of just jacking up the sampling rate. And it winds up getting you freer of aliasing, and you just start working on these things and stop having the assumptions of like, you must do everything on 40.1K because people can't hear anything else. You got to get thinking like that out of your head, because there are alternate reasons why that starts to pose problems. And it's an oversight. It is an oversight. It is taking analysis from people doing a lot of double-blind tests, which is already rather coarse, and jumping to conclusions about what that means in practice. So there you go. Had some nice herbal tea, that stuff. Is Celestial Seasonings Tension Tamer. It's delicious. Dusan Basic is a fan of cans A, B, and C. That's fair. Yeah. Well, that's why I did those things. And Pop is a fun compressor. It's possible that I can do that better. So far, that's what I got. Have I thought of doing a wire recorder emulation? Not really. It's possible. It's just one of those things where I could end up fooling with it, especially if I got one. Like if I got a wire recorder and I was like, what's going on with this? I can talk to Heinbach or something like that. Heinbach collects stuff like that. I don't tend to do that quite so often. Like, what I'm more excited about is, and it's interesting because this touches on kind of like how my life has gone. Like in recent weeks, I probably don't look as if I've been chewed up and spat out, or as if I've been really sick. Granted, I'm getting over the sort of flungy stuff, but that's been hovering around for a long time. Probably have some of that over the winter as well. But one of the things I've been doing in recent weeks is, like, I do therapy and stuff. I'm in recovery programs, and I try to keep myself fit, and I try to work on whatever issues I grew up with, which I feel is a worthy thing to do. And most recent one is a thing that people call memory reconsolidation. And there's been a This American Life episode about it. And I have done several sessions on that myself, and it was absolutely fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. It's like taking little bits that you build yourself out of, like these little traumatic chunks, fragments of existence that you survived somehow, and going like, this means this, and this means this, and this is how this is, and stuff. And the idea is you go back and you start running through that stuff, beginning from where it wasn't a problem and walking through the context of it through to where it again isn't a problem. Like, you cover the entire little range of whatever it was that was like a chunk of pain and they're bothering you. but you're doing this as an adult. I know things about my childhood that I did not know when I was a child. So when you go through this process, you wind up getting details that are partly because you were there, you've forgotten, you remember things that, the brain is an amazing thing. But it's also details of like, well, I know this was true, therefore it's plausible that this was part of the memory, and then it starts to peak up and you go, oh yeah, at the time I did not understand what this was. Like my family, like my folks both came out of painful environments. They were stable enough, you could say privileged enough. My dad was the son of a vice president at Chevrolet. I'm not making that up. He became apparently a bit of a spook, but he became a scientist and an astronomer, and he worked in an observatory and so on, got multiple patents, things like that. And struggled a lot with violent and abusive things that happened to him or his sister while he was little. My mom struggled a lot with the fact that my grandfather was her hero, her beloved daddy. He was really good. He was very cool. My grandma was a bit of a wild character. She drank. She smoked unfiltered cigarettes. She was a little wild and crazy and out of control. She drove a red Pontiac Firebird convertible that my uncle ended up inheriting. And when I was a child, it didn't really occur to me oh, this is what it's like when grandma is a alcoholic wild lady out of control, and mom is intimidated by having to be okay for her mother, but also mom is you're too wild, the hell. You can't necessarily come over to my house and see my children if you're not going to look after them responsibly. And lots of stuff like that comes up, and it gives you a bigger picture about how things are. And in a sense, Andy, will we ever get to hang out with Chris back? This is kind of what it is. I keep working on here, give me a second. If I turn that on, and I believe I know what this was going to do. So yeah, one of the reasons I'm getting some of these set up is because I need to be able to push a button, go to this camera, and move it off of that stand so that I can point it down here, and then we'll get together and do soldering or something, and I'll build stuff, because that's one of the things I was going to be talking about. I think that what I was getting onto that was the wire recorder emulation. That's what led me into this zone. First of all, talking about that childhood stuff, I guess it's Heinbach who reminded me of it, because he is this German man who's very into whiskey. I can't be drinking whiskey. It's not good for me. But, and collecting antique test equipment. To some extent, being able to collect roomfuls of antique test equipment, you got to be able to have a room to put all those things in, and you got to be able to pay for all of that stuff. And then when you're doing the YouTubing thing, you got to have your camera thing on point. Heinbach has always been really good at that. His production values are excellent. This is privilege. This is privilege. And it's all very well and good when people can do that. And I enjoy it when they, another guy is Ricky Tinez. I'm not quite sure how he manages to be as privileged as he is, but boy, he is, because he has got lovely production values and works with the nicest, tastiest stuff. And you hang out with him and it's wow, there's that guy, and he's right there, and he sounds clear as a bell, and oh, I feel like I'm in that room, and thousands upon thousands of dollars of gear to make all of that happen. And he's telling me about this sampler. He's telling me about this thing. Well, when I was a kid, I grew up in this family that came from privilege, but they also had a bunch of problems, attitudes and stuff. And I ended up as a bit of the black sheep of the family, to where they reacted in like their own shame and struggling with their own stuff by going, we need to make Chris get with it and start doing stuff right. He needs to go and get a good job, and he'll do the same kinds of things that Dad did when he like worked at observatories and worked in science and this and that, and had some gumption and went out and did stuff. And I was pretty seriously traumatized by then. Stuff that had gone on had broken me, but good. I turned to drugs. That made me feel better at the time, but it was also not a great idea because that only broke me worse. And by the time I was heavy into drugs as my refuge, when I came by it naturally because my mother and my grandmother and some other members of my family also were like alcoholics or on drugs. I spent the early part of my life believing that I was essentially a abandoned person without privilege and basically desperately poor, seriously broken, needing a lot of recovery, needing a lot of help, eventually making connections where I could have these things. But I became homeless at one point because my folks were like, you're just not trying, and so we're going to have to cut you off entirely. And I was like, fine, I don't love you anyway, so go away. And I lived in a homeless shelter. I went through processes of this dark underbelly of life, like normal people life. I lived normal people life in a way that people who are privileged don't normally do. And so when we talk about doing a wire recorder emulation, it reminds me of Heimbach, but it also reminds me that back when I had dropped out of college and I had basically nothing and was really struggling, my resources were not like, can I get this old test equipment off eBay? What's it going to be like when I get this test equipment for $400 and yet there is a piece that I need to do to adapt it to the other thing, and that's going to cost me $700. Oops, oh well. That kind of stuff. And by contrast, what I did have at the time was Mouser Electronics, which still exists. I still get stuff from them. And that's why I carry around, or I show you guys, these plastic tubes with chips in them, because that's what I had. I had a soldering iron, and rather than playing with a wire recorder and being like, how can I make a plugin for this? I'm all about wire recorder, let me show you this. Did you know that you could take this clip and solder a battery to it here, and some inputs here and outputs here, and then you can run your guitar through it and get a variety of different crazy screaming guitar distortion effects and stuff? And that's more likely to be what I will do in terms of hang out with Chris once I have all of my... Can I turn that back off again? No, it's on. Once I have this stuff working, so that I can do it in a way that's actually functional, we're likely to spend time hanging out, and I'll walk you through soldering some of this stuff together. And I won't necessarily be to the stage, because there's a specific stage in the Patreon where I'm going to start gathering together this stuff and sending it out as little care packages to people at cost. But I can easily tell you where to go to get these things. And it doesn't end up being that intense. Although I will tell you that sometimes there's the catch. I've gotten many things from UK manufacturers. If you're into synthesizer stuff, Thonk is a great resource. The trouble with that, and it is the trouble that somebody coming from privilege would never think about, but I do, is that if you get stuff from Thonk and you pay them, then you are very likely to be charged a extra duty that nobody tells you is being charged to the tune of like, I don't know, 5 cents, $1, $15, depending upon how big the order that you placed at the UK thing is. You wind up getting these little import duties, and they get taken straight out of your bank account, or at least that's the way that it was working for me. And then you look it up later and find out that's what happened. And that's dangerous, because as somebody who has lived the life of a normal person, randomly not having $10 in your bank account is a big ass deal. That could lead to you owing like $30 in fees from overdrafts and stuff, and it just snowballs, and it's terrifying. But like, and this is of course assuming we're talking about people ordering from inside the USA, but whatever. But Mouser exists inside the USA. So the thing about it is, without gathering the stuff together and like passing it on to people at cost, which is the plan for future developments, I can start doing some of this stuff. Like, here's how you solder together a circuit board. Here's how you plug. Like, I could do the guitar tube sound fuzz quite easily without even the schematic, without even the Craig Anderton book on the subject. Because the thing is, it's just a 4049 hex inverter chip. And you can wire a battery directly to the chip. If it's a 9-volt battery, it won't break the chip. You can make it a little more fancy by getting a capacitor as a power supply and wiring that on as well. And you take various different little capacitors and things to put the signal in and out of it, and it starts giving you all these possibilities, like make a high pass filter, make a low pass filter, various things like that become very easy to do. And it can start out as very, very simple. And the thing about it is, you can order, I'm trying to remember what the actual points are for volume discounts and stuff, but it's like a 39-cent chip, and if you're willing to drop like $39, boom, suddenly you have 100 of them. You have the same plastic tubes that I've been showing people. You got like roughly 3 of those, and that's all the 4049 chips that you will ever need for a really long time as far as just starting to experiment. And if you have those are all little amplification stages. That's what this particular chip is an input comes in and the opposite of the input goes out. But it's kind of, if you set it up so that there's a feedback in there, it goes kind of analog-y. It sits around at a partial voltage and it bleeds energy that way, but it's also a class A amplifier, so it gets real tubey. And if you have that little amplifier stage, you have like distortion, you have you can do high pass filters by picking smaller capacitors, you can do low pass filters by putting the capacitors across the feedback part. All of that kind of stuff to a wild degree of experimentation. I have built 5-band equalizer boxes out of 4049 chips. The things sounded amazing too. And that's probably what would most interest me as far as getting together and hanging out with Chris when some of these details, like I told you about the going out and doing the memory reconsolidation thing. I'm still working on that. I'm going to be doing that this week too. But once I've done that, especially going, I think, into the winter, everybody's going to be staying in a little bit more as if they aren't already. And that's a big chunk of what I've been wanting to do, but also it's a big chunk of why I've needed to have more than just like this one camera and so on. So I've got to be able to like hit a button and like, okay, watch me solder this. hit a button, here's your close-up, this is what it looks like to solder this thing to this thing, here's where it connects, this is what it's supposed to look like when it's done. That's important. I can't just do something, I mean I can, but I feel like I can't just do something with the, hi, I'm going to solder something with you. Here I am, and you can't see what I'm actually soldering, but I promise you that it's important and interesting. It's like, that doesn't work. That doesn't work. I have to be able to bring a little more to the table as far as that is concerned. So that, and the nice thing about that for people who are looking to hang out and spend more time is that can be a rather time-consuming quality. This also touches upon me talking about the learning to use Blender and stuff, things like that. Because the thing about that is, like soldering analog gear and that kind of stuff, I think it's great if you're into the right to repair movement. That is also very cool. I think it's just a generally positive thing to learn how to do. And especially if you're into music or synthesizers or guitars or any of those things, it's great to be able to take care of yourself in those ways. But we're also creatures of the digital age, and things like the video stuff for synthesis or whatever, increasingly a lot of that stuff lives in the digital world, and I'm still fascinated by the details of what kinds of things can be made. Like, I know Bodenarius is building plugins in Reaper, and that's interesting. I tend to focus on other platforms for plugin making. But when I was getting together with my brother Dan more often, that could still happen. I'm not exactly sure when, because we have some conflicts at the moment. But when that was happening, we spent a lot of time being like, we shall create a game now, therefore you will do this, and then we will program the logic of a game correctly and properly. And a lot of that wasn't fun for me to do, but it did lead me towards exploring these various game engines and things. And it led me to the Godot game engine. And I've been seeing that expand. Both me and Dan, as far as I know, Dan is still doing this. I can't see why he would have stopped, are supporting the Godot Patreon. And they are doing kind of what I do with the Airwindows project. Is this is a game engine, it's a running software thing that you can make games and applications and all manner of stuff on, depending upon what you're fixing to do. It's 2D oriented, but I've done stuff that's like, okay, you have all these little text entry boxes and things and sliders and controls and stuff. You can literally make like a weird little computer with this interface and stuff if you learn how to do that basic thing. So you can make elaborate calculators as long as you can sort of basically program. And I can do that up on screen. Like the Godot stuff, I can definitely share. So if I was to get into that and start fooling around with that kind of stuff, but rather than trying to reserve it for getting together with my brother and then having him tell me how everything I'm doing is wrong. And I honestly feel like if you're not doing stuff wrong lots of the time, you're clearly not trying hard enough. It's never about like picking only the correct steps and then going to only the next correct steps. You gotta try pushing the boundaries and running into stuff that you didn't expect or that you don't know. Otherwise, nothing new is being made. And I can do that just as well with a clamoring audience of amateurs trying to figure out what's going on. And the great thing, if I pick stuff like the Godot engine, if I pick stuff like Blender to fool with, you can have all of those things too. Those are all free open source projects. And I love that that is a thing that I can say in 2020, that that's real. Because it is. It's like, I may be interested in analog hardware. I may love making guitar stomp boxes. Not that I ever made all that many of them, but I did for a while there. I even ran advertising in, I got some of my stuff reviewed by Tapeop back in the day, long before I did plugins. There were little reviews of a few stomp boxes in Tapeop magazine, like pre-computer practically. And these are things, because in terms of the Q&A, in terms of that kind of stuff, one of the things I'm thinking about at the moment, and thinking about in the context of doing this stuff, and also me coming through these challenges where I've always strived very hard to accomplish the world and everything, is what am I here able to offer? I have felt like, yeah, I can keep putting out a plugin every week, and I do that because I wouldn't want to not do that. But is it useful to have 207 plugins when you only had 206? Like, I can't legitimately say each new plugin that I do, and I just put out Channel8, but I can't legitimately say each new plugin that I do, that's going to make your world better. It'll make you feel good because you're like, oh, here's a new toy. I get to have this. This is free. If it's absolutely wonderful, I can kick in some more money on Patreon, but I'm not going to make you. And if I wanted to make this thing, it would be able to sound magic and good and wonderful and stuff. And there could be an element of truth to it, but it's really more about making the thing. And that's where it starts getting like, I start becoming some kind of productivity guru. I'm asking the question, like I did in a previous Q&A, what do you make? What am I here to help you make more of? And it's an interesting question. I think it's a very human question. But it's definitely not all about, I'm going to give you further emulations of hardware devices for more and more plugins. Because in a way, that's almost like leading you the wrong direction. If I was doing that, it would be leading you the wrong direction, but I'm not. So it's all fine and good. But it is a problem to indicate to people like, oh, hey, here I am, and you need to pay me so that I can give you more and more of these toys. Like, I'm going to give you more and more Lego bricks because I see this stuff as kind of modular. And the purpose is, if you have all of those like Lego bricks of processing, then you will become enlightened and you'll have something to say and it'll be awesome and you'll feel great. You'll have a wonderful girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever it is that you like. And it becomes kind of a con game that way. So it reminds me of the experiences of a fellow that I've listened to a lot called Merlin Mann. He's one of those productivity guys, but he is a kind of interesting meta-productivity guy because he was associated with one of the biggest like productivity podcasts out there for some time, thing called Back to Work. I think he's still doing it, and many other things besides. And he's this interesting kind of manic character. He's interesting to listen to, and boy does he have a lot of ideas and a lot of personality. And he has had a good foil with this other guy called Dan Benjamin, who is a similarly interesting character who plays off of him well. And they started doing this stuff where he's like, more ideas about getting back to work and the productivity and blah, 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 blah. But then he started to realize that it was like he was spinning wheels. Everybody was most interested in doing stuff about productivity and nobody remembered to do anything. And so he became the meta-productivity guy, where he's getting into this sort of philosophical level of like, well, why do we create what we create? Why do we go through what we go through? And, after a few hundred episodes or so, you start going like, I'm going to go and do something else for a while, which is fair. That's absolutely fine. But it leads me asking some of the same questions that clearly I can do more years of plugins, and I'm not going to stop. If I think of anything that's a good plugin, there's certainly no problem with me making it, and I'm more than happy to put it out. That's one of the main ways in which I connect with the world. I like post a post on the Gear Sluts and KVR forums saying, I made this new thing, and that's a way that I am visible in some way. It's more trustworthy than like YouTube, for instance. And I certainly haven't messed with trying to be visible on Facebook because that's terrifying. But it also raises the question of if people are just hanging out because I'm like their internet friend, and there's no reason that I shouldn't be. I've been very isolated all my life. That's why I connect with you folks. I tend to make friends quickest when they're most like me, so there's a lot of people on the internet that are a lot like me, I gotta say. And granted, it's great to be doing these things, but I need to be able to like give you more as far as we can get caught up in doing this kind of stuff, and everybody can do things. And I know that is possible because I've done it. Back in the days of Airwindows on Kagi shareware, and this is a nice little object lesson for if you do things like that. I would particularly look at you, Bo, because people are starting to pay attention to the stuff that you do and download it and play with it and so on as well. So you're going to be in the same boat. Doing the Kagi shareware stuff, I had my plugin chops down, and I'm making these audio units for Macintoshes, and I was doing those for years, and always with this particular mode of, I wasn't open source at the time, but I also wasn't doing like copyright protection, and I was just building this thing where it's like, I'm going to do this stuff, I'm doing it the way that I want, I do not care whether people want a GUI or whatever. It's these little sliders. It's exactly what you're familiar with. That's what I always did. And I'm just going to talk to people like human beings, and this is just how I roll. Upon getting into like modular synthesizers, I'll point over here again. There is some stuff that I've got, like for instance, I've got a modular thing called Just Friends. It's essentially 6 related oscillators that can be re-triggered, and there's a knob that controls all of them at the same time, and there's a knob that spreads out the way that they behave and stuff. It's a thing. It's like you can use it as an envelope generator, you can use it as an oscillator, you can use it as a lot of things. And it's weird. Just Friends is by a company, Mannequins, and it's basically a creative person, and his explanations of stuff are flaky and highfalutin and kind of artistic. But when you start working with this stuff, often it's like, oh, I get how this works. Yeah, there's just this one knob, and then I can do this over here, and wow, I can think of all kinds of stuff that I can do with this. But his manuals are bizarre. And the thing about it is, and there's more mannequin stuff that I'd like to get, and there's some mannequin stuff that I'm not terribly interested in, or at least not yet. Maybe I will be if I start clicking with it and figure out what he does. And I wrote him. I jumped on Instagram or whatever. In some way or other, I got in connection with this guy, and I was like, oh yeah, cool, I'm loving it. This is really great. And the guy who invented the company Mannequins and made all of these things wrote back to me and was like, oh, how nice. Because I've been a big fan of yours for years. I've always been using your plugins. Like, and that is just so nice. It's so made a win. But my point is not the coolness of, oh, here's this guy, he's doing something cool. Turns out I influenced him and led him in that direction that led to him doing something cool that I then appreciated in turn. You know, or finding out that Tom Whitwell of Music Thing Modular is a lot like me and likes the fact that I do the stuff that he does and likes the fact that I did a firmware for his thing. It is that before this payback came, before these nice things of like, oh my God, he knows who I am. He's been following my stuff for years. In some ways, I'm maybe a little bit inspirational. I was doing that stuff and that was happening. like, it was all very well and good that I could be thrilled and delighted by somebody cool doing something and appreciating the stuff that I made or did. But I never knew about that all those years. I just had a willingness to keep doing it. Because the thing is, like, some of the good stuff you won't get to hear. Some of the good stuff out there from doing and making things, getting engaged with this kind of stuff, getting excited with it. Like, there's a degree to which, as frustrated as I am with this video stuff, I'm also very excited with it. I keep being able to take it up a notch. And I lose my mind over it sometimes. I'm like, why am I running through 2 separate Blackmagic design capture devices because the one doesn't work? This seems dumb. Why do I have to deal with this? It's annoying. If I had to buy the other one, that would be like hundreds of dollars extra just to get the stupid thing working. That seems deeply broken and wrong. But maybe there's somebody out there who is following what I'm doing and is like not in the chat, or they're in the chat and they're shy, they're not saying anything about it, and they're on the same path, and they're going, yeah, no, I have a similar problem. Why don't I just, I mean, it's not the right answer, but I want to do this thing. Let me take this one thing and run into the other thing, and then so on and so forth, because I just saw Chris kludge together this monstrosity of trying to make this thing work, and here he is. Sure, I'll do likewise. I will just try the thing, make it work, and then there they will be. And, you know, or like Bo says, coding in C or whatever. You wind up being able to have some kind of positive effect, even through your frustrations and difficulties, that you don't get to hear about. And then years later, somebody's like, oh, you think I'm a really cool person and you love the thing that I made? Aw, that feels extra happy for me because I've been following you this entire time and there's nothing like that. That's magic. That is magical when that happens. But it only happens because you spend years of struggling away, trying to do something, trying to make stuff work, and sort of putting it out there. And most of the time, you don't get anything back. If you're lucky, you get paid something. That's why I love Patreon, is you get to be paid something even when it's a very small amount. And as long as they don't break that, that'd be very cool. It's best if they don't break that, because that's kind of the whole guts of how that's a good thing. But, you know, if you're lucky, you can get paid something, but you get paid before you get praised. You get paid little amounts, especially if it's necessary. But even if you're just like making it very easy for people and they're not compelled to pay you, still some will, especially if they can spare it, you know. And you get that before you get people writing the little note saying like, I really appreciated the stuff that you did. So that would be my word on that subject, I guess, is be willing to put it out there, be willing to get together and do stuff. And I do hope to continue to get this video stuff together so that I can start sharing some of the stuff that I do with people. I think my main problem there is mostly scheduling. Like, I do stuff at weird hours and I run as a creature of habit, so there are times I've gotten better at, as far as like taking on too much and then being able to dial it back and not having to be rigorously consistent. For years, I had to run things so rigidly that, you know, I will be here on Tuesdays and Thursdays and so on, or Monday at this and Tuesday at this, and then I would do that until I burnt out and fell over and had to stop entirely. And I'm getting better at being able to be a little more flexible with that stuff. But it is going to require scheduling, and that does also mean that I have to figure out what are good times for people. So think about that. Like right now, there's like 21 people on the channel. So if you're doing this and you're interested in sharing some of this stuff with me, think about that. Think about what times and days would be good for you, because it really matters. Like I could be picking a time when somebody, for them, it would be 3 o'clock in the morning. It doesn't matter how much they would like to join me. They won't be able to if that's the condition. So I got to think in terms of that. And yeah, we will build this up and find cool things to do. And I don't know right now whether it's mostly going to be about soldering stomp boxes or whatever. It's certainly a possibility. The way I've got this set up right now, I could be running through my guitar amp and turn that up and put that right into the chat right now, which means that I could do a soldering a stomp box or a guitar box and then be demonstrating it on the fly, and you'd be able to hear a really nice quality version of what that sounded like as I was doing it. Although I would have to have headphones to hear what the live feed would sound like, but I can do that too. That's not a problem. And by the same token, stuff like Blender, I would be working on some kind of 3D modeling thing. And it would depend upon what I was doing. Like, I've been doing enough research on that there is a bundle. It's the sort of thing where it's like, $80 for 20,000 materials that you can use in Blender. And I would probably do that just because I wouldn't have to do every little bit of it myself. But that does take it away from you can have this for nothing and join me. But things like that, things like Godot in particular, the neat thing about Godot as opposed to things like Unity is known for the asset flips. Unity is known for you go onto the Unity asset store and then you buy yourself into having a game. Because you buy your models and you buy your this and you buy your that, and it costs you hundreds upon hundreds of dollars, but then you behave as if you were an actual game developer. And it's kind of nonsense. I don't really like or respect it. So when I was doing stuff in Unity, I was essentially making all of that stuff myself, and which is cool, although some of it I was doing in programs like Photoshop, because back in the day, Photoshop CS4 ran on modern computers, and I had that from years and years before. See you later, Bo. I'm going to be going momentarily too. But yeah, now we've got Krita. Krita. That is like a paint program, and it's another open source thing. It is not necessarily my favorite art program, but I don't spend a lot of time arting anyway. But I know how accessible it is, so it is of some interest to me. And there's all of that kind of stuff. Fair amount of the time, things like Blender or whatever become struggling with the problems and trying to problem solve stuff. And that is fine. But I'll be getting that together. So yeah, glancing over the chat and stuff. Yeah. Bo was mentioning about Juice. I don't use any of those things because they're all a little bit too complicated for me. But then I'm probably not going to become expert in any of them because I'm going to be busy doing stuff like making things in the Godot engine or whatever. And certainly other people. Also, when we talk about stuff like plugin frameworks like Juice, one of the things going on there, which is what I tend to avoid, is they start tying you to new versions of development environments, and I cannot have that because I develop stuff for older computers. That is what I consider kind of a moral choice, although people get really upset when I suggest that it is, because it suggests that they are being immoral not to do it. But the use of fancy GUI stuff that will give you all the newest and most niftiest everything ties you to newer and newer computers and chains people to having to upgrade their stuff in order for it to work. And sometimes that can be a big problem. Like all of my video problems I'm having are because something updated or isn't working successfully with Mojave, which isn't even the most recent version of macOS, and I can't fix it. This rig worked for a little while, and then it just stopped. It's dangerous to get too tied into stuff that is only the newest and greatest, because you wind up compelling people to dump huge quantities of money into just surviving and staying functional. And I have a moral problem with that. So yeah, on that emphatic note, I am going to rein this in, and I'm going to get a bit of a rest, and then I am going to go and mow my lawn, and I'm going to be doing more of this the memory reconsolidation stuff. There's probably not that much that I'll be telling you about, but if we end up spending lots of times like soldering or coding or whatever together, we'll probably have conversations along those lines. So I will say goodbye to you folks. It's Tom just showing up at the last moment. You're quite welcome. A lot of people are saying thank you, and yeah, absolutely, you're welcome. And we'll talk to you guys later, and I will use my little Blackmagic Dingus because I had to replace my entire video setup. So I don't have my fade to my little Airwindows image anymore. But what I can do is fade to black and talk to you guys later. So bye-bye. I'll post something probably not all that terribly interesting plugin wise this coming Sunday, and I'll see you on Monday. And we'll start working on getting some other times into the week. I'll do my music and so on as well. Laters.